Chapter 23. In July of 1984, the Ajays flew to Lagos as they always did for the summer holidays. They would spend 3 weeks with Uncle Kayode and his wife, using their home as a basque from which to visit Mama and Rmy, as well as other relatives in Lagos and Ibadan. In years past, visits to kinfolk were endless, but Uncle Bola and Uncle Joseph had now died and many other relatives had moved away. Bisi was living in Ghana with her 3 children, and worked as an accountant. In Accra, Auntie Bayo had left Nigeria shortly after her divorce, which had been messy because of Uncle Kayode's affair with Helene. Apparently the affair had begun in 1963, not long after Uncle Kayode's marriage to Bayo. Teo wondered sometimes how the relationship had started and what had made his uncle so sure about Hel and Ni. And what had made Hel and Ni so certain that Uncle Kayode wouldn't later find another woman to replace her? But these were not things one asked, not even to a heterodox like Uncle Kayode. Uncle Kayode had left the Nigerian army shortly after the Biafran War and gone to France to complete his engineering training, just as he had said he would. Teo presumed that it was during this time that his uncle lived with Hel and Ni in France, and then returned with her to Nigeria after his studies. They were married in 1974 and moved from the old house in Yaba to Victoria Island. Uncle Kayode held a senior position with the oil conglomerate ELF, while Hel and Ni worked from home as an artist. For a few years, Miriam had refused to stay with Uncle Kayode out of a sense of loyalty to Auntie Bayo, who had been her mentor at nursing school, but, with time, Miriam, like the rest of the extended family, came to love Helene, and it would have been hard not to. Helene was one of those rare expatriate women who embraced Nigeria and adopted its cultures to the point where it was easy to forget she was French. She even spoke English with a Yoruba accent rather than a French one. Often, when Teo was with Hel and Ni, he thought of Vanessa and allowed himself to fantasize he and Vanessa living happily together in a beautiful home such as Kayode and Hel owns. The house was a 5-minute walk from the ocean, and it was such a striking building that it had once featured in a design magazine under the caption, "Beauty in the Heart of Darkness." Uncle Kayode never liked the caption, but it certainly didn't annoy him enough to stop displaying several copies prominently throughout the house. Like most properties in this most expensive part of Lagos, none of the beauty was visible from the outside. A 10-foot-high concrete wall, laced with loops of barbed wire, encircled it, hiding it from public view. Even when the guards let people through the imposing steel gates, little of the actual house could be seen. From the front, leafy palm trees and thick bougainvillea obscured the building. Always, when they arrived at the Ogundleys, Kemi would announce that this was the sort of house she wanted when she grew up. And because the Ogundleys had no children of their own, they spoiled her. "When I have a house it will be just like Auntie Hel and Ni's," Kemi would say. "Maybe not so big, but it will have lots of art." And there was certainly an abundance of art in the Ogundleys' home, which sometimes reminded Teo of the Barkers' home in Oxford. Helene, like Edward, had collected paintings from around the world as well as sculptures and bronzes from across West Africa. On this visit, as a special treat for Kemi, Hel and Ni had invited 2 local artists to their house to talk about their craft. ONC was a carver and the other a bronze sculptor. Of course Kemi had been thrilled and Teo had watched with amusement as his daughter badgered the artists with questions. The carver, a man by the name of Akin, had brought a small collection of his works, including some statuettes of former colonial officers. The inspiration for these, he explained, came from a great-uncle who enjoyed telling stories, particularly about his former boss, named Lugard. When Teo heard this he could hardly contain his excitement. Might this be Lord Lugard? Many books had been written on the legendary British High Commissioner to Nigeria, but never from the perspective of Nigerians who knew and worked with him. So if this old man could still remember stories, that was certainly very exciting. When Akin offered to take Teo to see the uncle, Teo jumped at the opportunity. Miriam was less keen, complaining that Teo was not spending enough time with them, but Teo argued that this was a once-in-a-lifetime experience that he wasn't going to miss. Besides, since the uncle was an old man, he might not be around much longer. And isn't the mother also old? Miriam retorted, reminding him trip would delay their planned visit to Iboden. But what difference does a day or two make? Teo would not be dissuaded. The next day, Teo set off with Akin, on the 4-hour drive to the old man's village of Atan. They left early in the morning, avoiding the worst of the traffic and the accompanying street vendors who stuck to cars like magnets, thrusting everything, from boxes of rat poison to French perfumes, through open windows in hopes of a sale. As they drove out of Lagos beyond the lagoon, their landscape changed to one of dense rainforest, which gradually thinned as they progressed northward. It was the rainy season and mounds of rich, red earth lay by the side of the roads. For miles around, the landscape showed no sign of habitation. Only a few people walked along the side of the road, some of them children who waved excitedly at the passing cars. What a beautiful country, Teo thought, admiring the vast open space. They drove by roadside buckers that sold bush meat and firewood, and once they stopped to buy some peanuts and dodo akaya, which they ate in the car. As they continued their journey, the drive was peaceful, except for the occasional crazy driver who would overtake on bends. Mostly these were lorry drivers transporting farm produce, some of which would drop off the sides of their trucks as they sped by. The vehicles sported popular phrases painted on the back and sides in bright, florid letters, large enough for even the short-sighted to read. Allah saves, Jesus saves, the Almighty saves, as if this would guarantee them safer passage. Akin was playing some juju music on the crackly car radio, and while they began to speak of Akin's plans to move to Europe, he intended to spend just a day in the village before driving on to Ilorin for an exhibition of high work, with the hope of meeting a rich European or American sponsor. Thef arrived at the village in the middle of the day when the sun was fierce, and people sought shade from their work in the fields. The old man had gone out, so Akin went to find him, carving Teo to wait at home. HC sat on the grass beneath a tree drinking warm Coca-Cola and eating shelled groundnuts given to him by the woman of the house. After a while some young boys returned from school and started playing football close to where Teo sat. They used Sprite bottles as goal posts, reminding Teo that he had done the same as a child, and his mind wandered to other childhood memories. He remembered having to wake up early when the cock crowed to do his chores around the house, then bathe and eat. In those days everybody walked to school, so they needed a hearty breakfast that their mothers cooked. Sometimes it was porridge, or beans with yam, or sometimes akara, and, if it rained, father would drive them to school in his Morris Minor, otherwise they went by foot. along city paths and across the Ogunpa River. During the rainy season, Teo remembered that the river would occasionally rise so high they would have to remove their shocks and school uniform, place them in a canvas bag on their heads, and then wade through water that was occasionally chest high. School ended early in the afternoon, as it apparently still did, since these boys were out playing. Perhaps they also stopped at roadside buckers on their walk home to buy refreshments such as ground nuts, oranges and coconut milk before coming home to play football. As Teo continued to watch, he thought again of his future son and felt remorse for being impatient with Miriam. Pregnant women were entitled to be irritable, and he shouldn't have dismissed her concern for his mother. How many husbands could boast, as he did, of a wife who loved and cared for his mother just as much as her own? He would have to apologize when he got back, and now, as he waited, he picked up twig and drew a grid in the sand with 3 headings: F for family, W for work, O for other. Beneath F he wrote the word time. Despite all his denials to Miriam, he knew that he had been spending too many hours working and not enough at home. There were also other things to change. He had fallen into a bad habit of cutting Miriam out of discussions by referring to topics or people with whom she was not familiar. He did it as a way of asserting his intellectual interests. Because Miriam rarely asked about them, and, when she did, he found her questions superficial. But he knew that to talk above her, to simply make her more aware of what she didn't know, was not the way to solicit interest, and certainly wasn't strengthening their relationship. No doubt there were also things she would like to share with him. Perhaps, for her sake, he ought to make an effort to attend church again, and in this way they would share more in common. Perhaps it might make him less nervous about growing old with her, and, even if it didn't, it would surely be good for the children. Children were, after all, the one thing he and Miriam did share in common, and always would. On the work front, things were going well. Being chair of the Department of History was a considerable achievement for someone his age. He was proud of his staff and of the projects he had started, but he still needed to find ways of limiting his administrative duties in order to devote more hours to research. What should he write here? He should, perhaps, increase his physical activities now that he had officially entered middle age. And then there was the perennial question of what he had achieved at this supposed halfway point of his life. In one sense he knew he had every reason to be proud of his achievements, but he was chair of a department that was chronically understaffed. As a result, neither he nor his colleagues had been able to make their mark as scholars in the wider world of academia. The government had promised a review of higher education, but these were empty promises. Ike worked in the Ministry of Education, but had done nothing. Teo remembered their last encounter where he had challenged Ike on the situation, but he had refused to discuss his party's policies, saying instead that Teo was unreasonable in his expectations. But it was Ike, as far as Teo was concerned, who had lost his way. Teo was still thinking of Ike when Akin returned with the uncle. The uncle was indeed elderly and looked frail, but he had a youthful twinkle in his eye, as one might expect of a storyteller. Greetings were exchanged, and soon others from the village arrived to sit with the uncle and Teo. They talked about the village and the season's crops, while the women pounded yams and washed pots nearby in preparation for the evening meal. A bowl of water was brought for the men to rinse their hands, and then 2 large steaming plates of pounded yam and egusi soup were placed in front of them. The men took turns rolling balls of yam between their fingers and dipping them in the stew with its large pieces of chicken that rested at the bottom of the pot. More meat than usual, Teo guessed, in honor of him as their guest. They ate by the light of two kerosene lamps that attracted flying ants, which folded their wings and began crawling round and round the base of each light. Once the meal was finished, Teo hoped to ask the uncle some questions, but the old man had started a game of AO with his friends and it was soon time to sleep. Teo resigned himself to waiting until the next day and went to sleep recalling all that he could from a recent publication of Lugad's diaries. By the next morning Teo was keen to begin talking, but, by then, word had spread to a neighboring village that a professor had come, and visitors besieged the house. Men and women came with their children, or photographs of children, wanting to see what the professor could do to guarantee them places in universities. There was little Teo could do except show interest and concern. And by the end of the day he was exhausted. He wished that I and all the other government officials could see the desperation in these people's faces. The only hope for them was the future of a son or daughter, and that was tenuous. Teo tried not to be downhearted, but it was hard not to despair when it was his generation, the generation of Nigeria's independence, who were failing the country. Teo still had not spoken with the old man, nor had he contacted his family to tell them he would be returning later than planned, but he was not concerned about the latter. Delays were always to be expected. No news is good news, Mama used to say. Eventually, on the third day, Teo found a way of walking alone with the old man. So, what shall I tell you about my old boss, Lord Lugard? The old man smiled as he spoke. One can inform you that I commenced employment with my boss in the year of 1912. You know that was the time when Oga returned to Nigeria after being governor in Hong Kong? You follow? Yes, sir, Teo nodded. Occasionally the old man spoke to Teo in Yoruba, but his preference was English in a waff that reminded Teo of his father. He spoke in a formal and somewhat stylized English with a penchant for the words, you follow. But even before the time whereby I started employment with Lord Lugard and Lady Lugard, my father was in Lord Lugard's service before me. Baba was the one who accompanied Lord Lugard to Borgu to claim it away from their French. You follow? Yes, sir, Teo nodded, bemused by the man's obvious admiration for his old boss and wondering, as he continued recounting his stories, how much of his English had been learned from Lugard. Sometimes, HC would ask my advice on government matters, if there were no other white people around. That was when he would ask us questions. Iho nodded, finding this particularly interesting, as it was a side of Lugard not reflected in the diaries. And I'll tell you something else. The old man smiled. My boss liked our women. Ain? Tivo smiled. Is that so? Oh yes. The old man grinned. He used to ask my father to find him some good woman, and to this day there are some half-caste people in Nigeria who come from him. Teo laughed, his mind not racing with questions as the man continued to talk about his time with Lugard. As he talked, Tivo found himself thinking of his mother. The more he listened to older people, the more he realized how little he knew of Mama's life. He thought of Vanessa, too, and how good she must now be at these sorts of interviews. The walk had taken them around the old man's fields and they were now retracing their steps. "I have one more thing to show you," he said, as they approached the house. He disappeared into a back room and emerged minutes later with purple material draped over his arms. Teo thought he was bringing church robes, but then as he drew closer he peered in amazement at what lay in front of him. It was Lugad's official robe, the one he apparently detested wearing for meetings with local dignitaries but had been required to wear by His Majesty. "Keep the robe safely," Teo urged, "and don't let any British museum take it from you. Whatever someone offers to pay, you can be sure it won't be enough." By the time Teo left the village, 3 nights had passed and he looked for Wardio returning to the Ogundlis' home to rest, sleeping rough on dirt floors and bathing in cold water had taken its toll and he dozed in the back seat. He dreamed of a proper bed, 24-hour air conditioning and the sauna that awaited him in the luxury of Uncle Keode's home. The beautiful heart of darkness, Teo smiled to himself. He would shower and then sit outside in their gardens, next to the pool. Or perhaps he would retire to their guest cottage and lie with Miriam. Perhaps she would be in the mood to make love, but that was rare these days. Even when she hadn't been pregnant, their lovemaking had grown infrequent. With the exception of those days of hoped-for fertility, and how he hated their precision with which she made love then. For the rest of the time, her excuse was tiredness, but even on holiday she seemed to have little desire for him. Perhaps it was biological. He knew he was not the only husband to suffer from a wife's abstinence, yet he did not go outside to feed his physical desires as others did. He had considered it, but never wanted to risk it, more for Kemi's sake than for anything else. He dozed off again and dreamt of Helone's cooking and then Helone turned into Vanessa, and the house was no longer in Lagos but in Dakar. He was lying with Vanessa in the guest cottage and kissing her when their dream stopped. The car had broken down. Several more hours were wasted by the side of the road in the stifling heat, waiting for the vehicle to be repaired. Teo stayed awake for the rest of the Joyride_7_. Knowing that he would have to direct the driver to the house. At least they had managed to avoid the worst of Lagos traffic, but as they drove closer Teo was surprised to see THC Gatks with Kapknan cars parked Kvaruk inside. And outside was Uncle Keode holding some sort of meeting or party at his home. Was someone ill? Had someone died? One of the guards ran to the car. "Oh gas ah. What is it?" Teo asked, quickly opening his door and ignoring the driver's plea for money. Miriam was running towards him from the house with brother Remy beside her. "Where've you been since Monday? We've been trying to contact you," she shouted. "Mama is dead," she sobbed. "Mama?" The words reeled in his head as he gripped Miriam's arms for support. "Where were you?" she sobbed. "Everyone was trying to find you." In keeping with Muslim tradition, the family had buried Mama's body within 24 hours, not waiting for Teo to return, but they had delayed the funeral party for him, as well as for others returning to Ibadan from overseas. When older people died, the grieving took place at the burial. After the funeral, sometimes a few days later, as was the case for Mama, there was a party to celebrate their deceased's life. Now that Teo had returned, the party could be arranged and he and each of his brothers and sisters would be expected to prepare food in Mama's house, and serve it to the guests who would arrive throughout the day. Miriam had already chosen the special asoebi for the family to wear, which bore a picture of Mama. Musicians would come and they would write a song for Mama, singing her praises and reflecting on the life she had lived as well as